Hello, and welcome to our next ACE research review. And in this session, we're looking at how much is too much. Indeed. So the paper of interest today is a very interesting paper by Fredenson and colleagues, where they looked at how much running is too much, identifying high-risk running sessions in a cohort of 5,000 people. So a really well-controlled study. Let's dive into the study design. So essentially, the population was 5,000 recreational runners. So that was the cohort. The intervention was essentially tracking their single session running distance. So that's the volume over a year and a half using GPS watches or devices. So quite objective data. The comparator was how each run compared to the longest run they had done in the past 28 days. So that's what they were comparing to, not to a control group in a traditional study design. The outcomes were whether they reported an overuse or traumatic running related injury across this period of time. So, from a study perspective, the strengths were obviously a very large sample size, long follow up, and very objective GPS data rather than relying on subjective recall, for example. It also tackled the concept of a single session spike, and this is relatively new in the world of athlete and load monitoring. Okay, we've always looked at weekly, monthly, and annual trends. So this is certainly shedding light on a new way to look at training load. From a weakness-wise perspective, like every study design, it won't be perfect. The injuries were self-reported, so there's certainly potential for bias. And the findings certainly at this point only apply to the cohort, which is runners, not necessarily all sports. And the observational design means we can't claim cause and effect. So coaches traditionally monitor weekly training loads. And one of the ways we do that is through a metric called the acute to chronic workload ratio. That's a very commonly used tool to monitor training load. So that's the older way of monitoring training load. Obviously, in this study, we're looking at single session spikes. So what happens when there's a change in the single session as opposed to a longer period of time. And critically, most injuries occur after one big jump in distance because it's running and distance is the way we track volume. And this concept translates to other sports when any athlete suddenly changes up their training volume. For example, in combat sports, if a combat athlete suddenly ramps up the number of rounds they do or the sparring intensity, that would qualify as a training load. So different sports have different ways to monitor and measure training volumes and intensities, and it's good to be across that. A key point is the risk for injury rises when that training load spike in a single session goes above 10%. Now, if we turn our attention to the graph here, we can see that the blue line represents overuse injuries, and this rapidly rises when the orange line for traumatic injuries climbs much more slowly. So essentially, by around 200 running sessions, which is roughly 30% of the participants, had reported an overuse injury, and 12% actually reported a more serious traumatic injury. So we've got overuse injuries and more serious injuries. 30% reporting overuse, 12% reporting something more serious. So this visual emphasizes that overuse injuries accumulate earlier and more frequently than traumatic ones, which is a little bit counterintuitive because historically our view of overuse injuries is that they're slow burners, they're accumulating over time, and it's eventually the straw that breaks the camel's back when we get a symptom. Something to keep in mind. So it's really important we understand this new concept of single session risk. And again, using more data from this paper, when runners kept their distance, their running distance within 10% of their previous longest run, the hazard line, so we're looking at hazard risk ratios here, stays near one. So if we look at the graph, there's one, risk is here, one, here's training load. So keeping it around here is a good way. It's lower risk, around 1. So within 10%, it's A-OK. However, once the session distance climbed to more than 10%, injury risk rose more steeply. A small spike of 10 to 30% boosted the hazard risk ratio by 64%. So a small change, meaning that if, from session to session, there was an increase between 10 and 30% that increased the risk to 64%. Now, if we look at moderate spikes, if we then look at training loads that go from 30 up to 100%, it goes to 52. And then if we double the distance, it raises the risk ratio to 128%. So that's a really important, clear take home. Do not double the distance from session to session. For whatever it is you're doing, whatever training you're doing, if last session you did X amount and this session you do a random change, you randomly decide to change what you're doing and increase the amount of work that you do. And remember, that work can be distance and running. In the gym, it could be sets, reps, load. In combat sports, it could be how many rounds you do. So things like that can very quickly increase the risk. So a very clear takeaway is avoid sudden, big, and unplanned jumps in training load if you do not want to get injured, if you want to keep the risk for injury low. So key findings really from this study is that small spikes increase the risk to 64, moderate 52, and those doubling their training load will almost certainly double the risk or incrementally increase the risk. Put simply, keep within a 10% bandwidth. And also understand that weekly metrics, so your session to session, is more predictive than the old week to week over a month longer term. So we really got to start thinking about what am I doing in this session and what have I just done the last session and how's that changing rather than looking at across the week, across the month, and then across the years. So we're starting to see that the evidence is pointing towards these risk ratios being greater when we're looking at intra-session variability. So some practical take homes. Obviously, you've got to know your baseline. If you don't know what you're doing from session to session, you've got no way of knowing how much risk you're at when you walk into the gym or your training environment. You've got to know your baseline. What is your baseline? So for athletes and coaches, establish a baseline by tracking the volume of work you do. So if you're running, that's pretty obvious. As in this study, they use GPS, and the GPS will tell them exactly how far they ran, what was the distance. Or you're obviously running to a set distance. However, in other sports, you might need to be a bit more creative. I would point towards the use of emerging technologies like wearable trackers. They're great. They can tell you what sort of work you're doing. I'll give you an example of that in a second. But know your baseline, critical. A single session increase greater than 10% constitutes danger. Okay, so once you know your baseline, then you can work out that it's okay in this session to increase the number of sets I do, the number of rounds I do, etc. As long as it's not more than 10%. Plan sessions to avoid consecutive spikes. So sometimes, from time to time, you might end up exceeding this 10% rule, but that certainly shouldn't be something you do on a regular basis. So you've got to have some sort of planning and systematic structure to what you're doing. And remember that the principle of sudden load jumps applies across all sports. This has been reported on before, although usually it's reported in a more chronic scenario. We're now seeing this paper reporting on what happens when we see it in its session to session. So to give you an example of how we could potentially try and apply some of the findings from this study and take advantage of technology such as wearable trackers. So on this slide, you can see what I've done is tracked the amount of work I was doing in a pad session, so a tired pad session. I was wearing a punch tracker under my glove, and that punch tracker tells me how many punches I threw. And you can see that on the graph here. So punch count, that's the total number of punches count. That represents my volume, aka the same way a GPS tells a runner how many kilometers they've done, this punch tracker tells me how many punches I've done, and I can use that to track my volume. so I know what I'm doing session to session. The tracker also gives me an intensity metric, which is, probably not as important as the volume, and a speed metric, which represents my intensity. And again, that would be analogous to my running speed, which a GPS will tell me when I run, how far I ran and what speeds I ran at. So I get volume and intensity from this tracker, which is really useful. And historically, in sports like combat sports, we haven't had this technology, so we'd have to go by feel, but now we can be much more objective. And then you can see on the slide how that varies to the next session I did a few days later, where we changed up the way I was training, and we call freestyle rounds fight simulation rounds. They're more intense. And again, you can see what happens when I change the style of training. Notice that my punch count goes up, and notice that my punching speed, the average speed, goes from 9.5 to 11 because we've got more fight simulation going on. So that then gives me a bit of an understanding. That was my baseline. So I did that without any preconceived plan, just to see what effect the training intention has on volume and intensity. And then what I can do with that information, use that, that's my baseline. I then created this program, this approach to be more systematic and structured so I can avoid intra-session jumps in my training volume. And I've applied some basic periodization principles with that baseline information. And I've got a plan now to make sure that I don't overdo it from session to session. You can see here, for example, that Tuesday's focus will have 2 fight simulation rounds. Friday, in this base accumulation phase, will have none. We've got some velocity targets to keep me in those bandwidths, and we've got some volume targets, total punch count again. So we've got volume and intensity bandwidths to keep me controlled. And then we can see through blocks of training, we've got these blocks of training where I'll alternate from higher volume to lower volume, higher intensity to lower intensity, with some deload weeks to make sure I'm taking consideration the effect of accumulated load, so for rejuvenation. Okay, so these principles can certainly be applied to other sports, although of course taking into considerations that the findings from these studies at this point are very specific to running. Nevertheless, the general principles can be applied elsewhere. So the bottom line: train smart, progress slow. Track your longest session, have a baseline. Keep jumps under 10%. Plan recovery. So if you do have an unplanned spike, make sure you take account for that by including more recovery. Okay, so think about what other recovery modalities you can use to make sure you recover from that sudden spike and not go into your next session carrying that residual fatigue. Okay. So overall, the findings really do suggest that there is a bit more attention that needs to be paid to our session to session training volume variability, and that's really important. And prevent before you rehab, of course. So prevention's always better than cure. So if you take into account these principles, hopefully you're doing a lot more to prevent the injury rather than having to address it through a rehab program. All right, so that concludes our research summary for this newsletter. Thanks for your attention.